The fateful evening in Massachusetts. It was September 15, 1981, in a peacefully unremarkable suburb just outside Boston, Massachusetts. A place where the tallest drama was the local high school's football rivalry, and neighbors trusted one another enough to rarely lock their doors. That late afternoon, dusk crept gently across the well-tended lawns and maple tree-lined streets. It was the first true chill after a long summer, and the air buzzed with that peculiar excitement of a new school year. Families lingered over early dinners, sprinklers ticked in the distance, and a few kids, free from the burden of homework on that inaugural day, pedaled their bikes, chasing precious remnants of daylight. Among them was 10-year-old Emily Carmichael, a bright, petite girl whose blonde hair always escaped her ponytail. She was heading home from her cousin's house in West Newton, just a short ride away, traveling a route she'd taken countless times, one that wound through a patch of woods, a stretch of quiet road shadowed by thick foliage so familiar the trees bore initials carved by generations. Emily was known for her independence. Her parents had always trusted her common sense, and that day was no exception. As she hopped on her bright red bike, she called goodbye to her relatives, flashed her signature gap-toothed grin, and set off, promising to be home before dusk. The route was simple, placid in the eyes of any seasoned adult. Turn left onto Main Street, cut through a leafy woodland path bordering the Charles River, emerge at someone's backyard, and follow the small neighborhood loop to Auburndale. It was barely a 10-minute journey, yet, as darkness slowly overtook the sky and the crickets began their chorus, Emily never arrived at home. Something so unthinkable that it would shatter every assumption the neighborhood held about safety, trust, and the innocence of quiet American life. By 7:45 p.m., with the streetlights flickering on and no sign of Emily at the dinner table, her mother Carla's worry gnawed into panic. She called her sister, her voice already trembling, only to hear that Emily had left right on time. The next hours blurred into confusion and fear, calls made to neighbors, anxious walks retracing possible paths, even the family dog leash in hand searching for a whiff of Emily's favorite berry-scented shampoo. Strangers joined the search without a second thought. This wasn't just the Carmichael's daughter now. As night deepened and worry ripened into dread, one of the search parties discovered Emily's bicycle lying askew off the main path, its handlebars still warm. What began as a routine evening became the genesis of one of Massachusetts' most chilling and debated missing person cases, a catalytic moment that forever altered not only one quiet neighborhood, but the perception of every American parent who ever watched their child disappear around the corner and assumed, naturally, they'd be right back. Emily childhood in American suburbia. Emily Carmichael was born on a crisp October morning in 1971, the last child of Thomas, a bespectacled high school science teacher with a fondness for jazz, and Carla, whose devotion to her home and children set the tone for the Carmichael household. Emily had two older brothers, Michael and Ben, and a sister named Lisa. The Carmichaels embodied suburban middle class, barbecues in the backyard, roller skates left at the side of the porch, a battered station wagon always brimming with sports equipment and science fair supplies. From the earliest age, Emily was a force of nature. Family photos show a tow-headed toddler already attempting cartwheels on the lawn, grinning at a birthday cake smeared up to her nose, or fashioning her own art supplies from scraps around the house. She was insatiably curious. Her first word was supposedly "why?" and her hunger to learn stretched from the kitchen through to the woods behind the house. Unlike her siblings who tended to stay close to home, Emily reveled in small adventures, organizing neighborhood scavenger hunts, persuading her friends to form a makeshift band in her garage, or trying to construct tree forts high into the maples. A natural performer, Emily loved to sing, so much so that the Carmichaels' neighbors often heard her belting out show tunes from the backyard swing. She could spend hours sketching animals, drawing elaborate maps of imaginary kingdoms, or practicing gymnastics routines on the patch of grass beside the garden. Her room was a riot of color, wall posters of Olympic gymnasts, shelves stacked with library books, and a growing collection of ribbons from local competitions. If Emily had a heart beyond her family, it belonged to gymnastics. She begged her mother for lessons after watching the 1976 Montreal Olympics on a battered black and white television. Emily's devotion was immediate and total. She was the first one at the gym and the last to leave, her coach liked to say. Mornings saw her up early, stretching in the living room. Evenings she practiced handstands or cartwheels until bedtime. Bolstered by determination, Emily dreamt not only of medals but of the sheer thrill of flight. "I want to see what the world looks like upside down." For all her energy and ambition, Emily was reliably empathetic. She had a talent for befriending shy classmates, for lending her new crayons to the nervous kids at the lunch table, for rescuing stray kittens and heroic worms stranded on the sidewalk after rain. At home, she was the peacemaker in sibling squabbles, the first to offer a hug when someone scraped a knee. Her teachers described her as sunshine in sneakers. That friendly, independent streak endeared Emily to the whole neighborhood. Parents praised her common sense and responsibility, sometimes to a fault. "Emily knows those woods like her own backyard," they'd say, trusting her to ride her bike home even as dusk settled. On weekends, her family attended church potlucks, and Emily was known for her apple pies, with a little extra cinnamon, or for orchestrating impromptu pony rides at local fairs. For a time, life in the Carmichael house revolved in a gentle orbit around Emily's laughter and movement, a messy, joyful choreography of daily affection, hard work, and relentless optimism. No one could have imagined that even the most ordinary Wednesday afternoon, full of bicycles and piano practice and casserole dishes, could ever hold the seeds of one of the state's darkest mysteries. The first day of school and daily routine. The morning of September 15, 1981 dawned crisp with an edge of lingering summer warmth in Auburndale, Massachusetts. Emily Carmichael awoke just before her alarm, a habit she'd developed after weeks of nervously anticipating her first day at Newton Middle School. The Carmichael household was a blur of clattering spoons, the faint smell of burnt toast, her brother Ben's signature, and the morning news humming low on the kitchen radio. Her mom, Carla, fretted quietly about lunches and schedules while Dad reminded everyone for the fifth time that the new school year meant a new start, a chance to be a little braver, a little kinder. Emily dressed herself in her favorite sky blue cardigan and corduroy pants, her shoes freshly scrubbed and a peach-scented ribbon clipped into her stubborn hair. She ate a bowl of cereal with her siblings, the familiar comfort of clinking spoons and shared glances easing her nervousness. There was a big energy in the house that morning. The mixture of excitement and anxiety every American kid knows when they return to school after a long, lazy summer. The walk to the bus stop was accented by the crunch of leaves already falling, even though it wasn't quite autumn. Neighbors waved, parents took last-minute photos for scrapbooks, and groups of kids congregated with backpacks slung over one shoulder, swapping stories of summer camps and secret tree houses. Emily hugged her mother tightly at the curb, she never outgrew this habit, before scrambling onto the big yellow school bus, waving from the window until the corner turned. Newton Middle School was a brick labyrinth smelling faintly of polished floors and chalk dust, with hallways echoing with giggles and the nervous shuffling of new sneakers. For Emily, everything was bigger, the lockers, the classrooms, the expectations. Still, she settled in quickly, her natural inquisitiveness leading her to introduce herself to classmates, teachers, even the friendly custodian who always had a puppy sticker for well-mannered kids. She spent her lunch talking to a shy girl from homeroom, already planning how to include her in the next recess game. After school, the routine was familiar and comforting, a rhythm carefully orchestrated by the Carmichaels over the years. Emily would hurry home, drop her school bag on the hook in the mudroom, and before doing any homework, spend 30 minutes practicing piano alongside her brother Michael, who was working on a complicated Chopin piece. Music offered a shared sanctuary for the siblings, a quiet before the rush of after-school activities. By 4:30, Emily would trade sheet music for Leotard, and slip out the back door, her trusty red bicycle waiting for her like an old friend. The ride to gymnastics practice was just under 3 miles, a familiar course winding through leafy streets and past the Charles River, where the water reflected the sky like a second, slightly rippled world. Sometimes she would shout a greeting to the old fisherman casting lines from the bank, or stop briefly to pet a neighbor's golden retriever. If practice finished before dark, Emily would often visit her cousin Sophie, whose family lived less than a mile away. Their time together was always vibrant, swapping secrets in the backyard, sneaking a cookie from the cooling rack, plotting the next big adventure, from forming a detective agency to writing their own newsletter for the block. Dinner back home was a family ritual, no distractions, everyone sharing a highlight from their day, laughter interspersed with reminders about chores and plans for the upcoming weekend. Emily loved these evenings, the comfort of routine and togetherness grounding her in a world that felt, for a little while, perfectly safe and ordinary. Nothing out of the ordinary ever happened in Auburndale, or so everyone believed. The steady cadence of school, practice, family, repeat, No one imagined that one ordinary Tuesday might, in just a few missing minutes, change everything forever. The fateful ride home. By the time the sun hovered low over the tree line on September 15, 1981, Emily Carmichael's world was winding down in all the normal, comforting ways. Across the quiet streets of suburban West Newton, families began to clear dinner plates and children squeezed in last games before the call of homework and bedtime. At her cousin Sophie's home, the kitchen was still warm with laughter and the faint smell of baked chicken. Emily lingered, a little longer than usual, trading knock-knock jokes and a secretive smile with her cousin, both blissfully unaware of how precious these ordinary seconds would soon become. It was 7:10 p.m. when Carla Carmichael called, her tone gentle but unarguable. "Remember, hun, you need to be home before dark. It's just a 10-minute ride, but don't dawdle and stay on the main path." These were the kind of rules Emily had known since she could pedal. She assured her mom she'd head out right away, and after one last hug, she slipped her arms into her soft gray jacket, grabbed her red backpack, and rolled her sturdy red bike from the porch. Outside, the sky was a bruised watercolor, dusky, deepening, with just a faint orange afterglow at the horizon. The street that wound to her house was still dotted with familiar streetlights, but shadows stretched into the thick cluster of maples that formed a natural divide between neighborhoods. Emily had always felt brave in those woods, treating the winding shortcut as her personal adventure lane, a tunnel where sunbeams had danced hours earlier and birds now rustled low, settling in for the night. She was careful though, her parents' voice always in her head, the quickening air a steady reminder of responsibility for a girl both curious and wise beyond her years. As she started down the lane, the tires hummed over scattered acorns and the scent of earth filled the air, sharp after a heat wave had finally broken. Her mind lingered on gymnastics routines, a story her cousin shared, and the piano duet she'd try with her brother tomorrow. Headlights from passing cars flashed through the trees, reminding her she wasn't completely alone. Passing by the old oak with its teenage initials carved deep, she glanced over her shoulder, half imagining she could see herself there years before, a smaller version wobbling on training wheels. At the halfway point, where the path cut closest to the Charles River, Emily slowed for a moment, catching a glimpse of water glinting through the trunks, a sound of distant laughter drifting from a backyard behind her. She smiled, part anticipation, part habit, knowing she was minutes from home, the comfort of her family, and the promise of a hot shower and maybe, just maybe, a bedtime snack snuck from the kitchen. But somewhere in that corridor of trees, on those last familiar bends, Emily Carmichael vanished. No splash, no scream, just the sudden silence that sometimes slips into the places children leave behind. Her bike would later be discovered, half hidden in undergrowth, its handlebars askew as if set gently down by hurried hands. The small, everyday route a 10-year-old took in a trusted town became, in that instant, the edge of a nightmare, transforming a sleepy suburb into the heart of a mystery and a family's world into a chasm of unanswered questions. First alarm: family in chaos. The Carmichael house was never meant to be a place of chaos. For most of their lives, evenings were a comforting swirl of piano music, clinking dinnerware, and the low murmur of Bob Newhart reruns. But on September 15, 1981, everything changed. It started as a small, persistent worry, a feeling that surely Emily was just running a minute late, maybe stopped to pick wildflowers by the river or chat with a neighbor. Carla tried distracting herself by folding laundry, glancing at the glowing clock on the kitchen wall. Emily's plate grew colder. Thomas circled the kitchen pretending to read the paper, but his eyes never settled on the words. The siblings asked, "Is she home yet?" and received gentle, increasingly snappish, "Not yet, sweetheart." As the hands on the clock slipped past a half hour, Carla's anxiety grew into a thumping panic. She picked up the phone, dialing her sister's number with numb fingers. "She left almost an hour ago," her sister replied, voice tight. "Probably just took the long way, she always does." But even as they tried to convince themselves, the grip of fear was tightening. The Carmichaels leaped into action. Carla searched the backyard, calling Emily's name until her voice was hoarse. Thomas jogged the length of their street and into the nearby park, peering behind every bush and tree, feeling foolish and frantic all at once. Michael and Ben hopped on their bikes, scouring the winding paths Emily would have taken home. Lisa stood by the kitchen window, tears starting to pool, her uneaten dinner forgotten. Neighbors noticed the commotion and joined the search. Flashlights bobbed in the dusk. The air was full of shouts, sometimes hopeful, sometimes desperate. The family retraced every possible route, calling into the shadows, asking every passerby, "Have you seen a little blonde girl on a red bike?" Dogs barked in backyards, their owners stepping outside in pajama pants and slippers, compelled by worry and communal instinct. By nightfall, panic had set in. The Carmichaels called the police. Within minutes, officers swept onto the scene, bringing a calm professionalism that was only partly reassuring. They asked for a recent photo, a clothing description, the precise route Emily would have taken. Carla dug through the junk drawer for a Polaroid. The picture showed Emily grinning beside a sandcastle, impossibly alive and present. As word spread, more and more community members joined the search. Teenagers combed the woods with flashlights. Church volunteers knocked on doors. Someone drove to neighboring towns, posting flyers at diners and convenience stores. A volunteer brought a bloodhound, its nose low to the ground, tracing scent along the woodland path. With each passing hour, hope flickered lower. Thomas choked back tears as he gave his statement to police. Carla clung to Lisa on the front porch, both shivering under a blanket even though it wasn't cold. Occasionally a police radio would crackle with news, unidentified bike tracks, a jacket found, but none belonged to Emily. And when, near midnight, a searcher called out from the woods, a child's red bicycle, muddy but intact, abandoned off the main path, everyone froze, caught between a surge of hope and a wave of dread. That moment marked the divide. There was life before that night, and all the normal chaos of a large family. And then there was everything after, a world reordered by fear, and the kind of heartbreak that only happens to other families, until, suddenly, it happens to yours. The media descends. Terror spreads. In the earliest hours following Emily Carmichael's disappearance, the local search parties still clung to the hope that this was a misunderstanding, a child lost, perhaps frightened, and soon to be found. But as dawn crept over Auburndale and neighboring towns, that hope began to unravel, replaced by a mounting sense of alarm that drew attention beyond the community's borders. By mid-morning, the first police cars still idled at curbs, their blinking lights a warning beacon. Officers, weary and tight-lipped, coordinated with volunteers. Maps of the area, hastily drawn, were taped to the hoods of squad cars. The steady pulse of walkie-talkies harmonized with the distant barking of search dogs and the shuffling footsteps of those refusing to rest until the little girl was found. The first wave of media arrived in battered news vans emblazoned with Boston's most recognizable call letters. At first it was just a reporter and a camera operator, both careful to keep their distance, quietly approaching the Carmichael home and politely requesting a statement. The family, drained from a night of terror and uncertainty, initially refused. Carla Carmichael, her voice raw from hours of shouting her daughter's name into the woods, asked them to leave her family in peace. But as the morning wore on, the crowd grew. Journalists with notepads, radio reporters with cumbersome headsets, and a growing sea of camera lenses trained on the house. Even as the Carmichaels shielded their faces, neighbors watched the spectacle, hands clasped in tense sympathy. By noon, the missing child report ran on local radio stations. By 1 o'clock, every major news channel in Massachusetts had broadcast Emily's picture. A gap-toothed smile, blonde hair wild from play, bright eyes seemingly alive and searching from every television screen. It was no longer just a family's nightmare, but a story that reverberated across dinner tables, coffee breaks, and school hallways throughout the state. Teachers, upon learning the news, gathered their classes for impromptu discussions on safety. Entire offices paused as radios delivered updates about the search, some listeners clutching their own children close before bedtime that night. The police, realizing the scale of attention, organized a formal press conference at the town hall, a low red brick building usually reserved for bake sales and budget meetings. The mayor, pale and shaken, delivered a prepared statement beside the police chief. Behind them, a row of officers stood stone-faced, their arms crossed, as the mayor urged anyone with information to step forward. Reporters shouted questions. Was this a random act? Had there been previous threats? Had any ransom calls been received? Authorities declined to answer specifics, choosing instead to emphasize the need for calm and the importance of eyewitness accounts. Missing posters were stapled to telephone poles, taped in the windows of supermarkets, libraries, and churches. Local businesses printed stacks of flyers at their own expense and offered rewards for leads. Some shopkeepers left out baskets of granola bars and coffee for searchers, while others set up bulletin boards at the front of their stores, displaying updates and tips. The media scrutiny was relentless. Live trucks lined the block, satellite dishes pointed skyward as reporters delivered breathless updates on the hour. The sight of so many cameras unnerved the Carmichaels further. Neighbors found themselves interviewed outside their homes, reliving the girls' comings and goings in minute detail. Even minor details became newsworthy. The kind of bike Emily rode, the music she liked, the shortcut she took through the woods, a relentless cataloging of every facet of one family's heartbreak. More troublingly, rumors began to swirl. Some television news segments speculated about possible strangers in the neighborhood. Others drew parallels to older unsolved cases, even dredging up years-old arguments between neighbors as possible motives for foul play. National networks soon picked up the story, and Auburndale, a quiet, safe suburb, became a shorthand for parental fear across America. The psychological toll on the Carmichael family was immense. The house, once filled with the rhythms of normalcy, became a fortress of grief under an unyielding spotlight. Inside, Thomas Carmichael fielded calls from relatives as far as California and Florida, all of whom had seen the televised plea for help. School friends left stuffed animals and homemade drawings on the front porch. Carla, though exhausted, took a brief interview at the behest of the search coordinator. Her voice, wavering, described her daughter's kindness, her laugh, and her habit of coming home right on time. The clip went viral, replayed on stations across the Northeast and stirring public sympathy, but also drawing unsought contact from would-be psychics, conspiracy theorists, and strangers promising hidden knowledge. The Carmichaels' phone rang day and night, the line alternately clogged by well-wishers and those seeking morbid curiosity. As the manhunt expanded, media cooperation with the police grew tense. While officers pleaded with the public to avoid wild speculation and allow them to investigate unimpeded, reporters pressed ever more aggressively for exclusive updates. News helicopters circled low above wooded areas, their rotors thrumming overhead search teams. Some outlets published overly dramatic headlines and graphic details, frightening parents across the region, causing schools in nearby towns to restrict recess to indoors, and leading to new stranger danger discussions in classrooms. Outside the Carmichael home, grief counselors, church leaders, and volunteer coordinators arrived in a steady stream, each hoping to offer comfort or coordination, and each, unknowingly, feeding the spectacle. A makeshift memorial sprouted on the sidewalk. Candles, handwritten letters, and bouquets choked the curb, surrounded by news cameras that never blinked. National correspondents began appearing with satellite trucks, broadcasting live to an audience now numbering in the millions. With so much attention on Auburndale, tip lines overheated, generating hundreds of leads. Some were well-meaning, others were malicious, meant to sow confusion or falsely redirect suspicion. The search operation had grown far beyond a local rescue, now resembling a national movement. Social workers gave on-air advice about trauma, politicians made appearances at search rallies, celebrities publicly offered rewards for Emily's return. The case became a lightning rod for debates about child safety, prompting calls for new legislation, neighborhood watch programs, and even the remaking of playgrounds to be safer. In a matter of days, the loss of one little girl had shifted the behavior and mindset of entire communities. For the families of Auburndale, daily life buckled under the weight of this new, ever-present anxiety. Children were forbidden to walk or ride bikes unsupervised. Parents redoubled every precaution, hovering anxiously at bus stops and herding kids in groups to and from school. The woods, once a playground for neighborhood adventures, became a forbidden zone. Rumors swirled of footprints, shadowy figures, and police activities hidden among the trees. Teachers noticed their students' jumpiness. Some drew pictures of the lost girl. Others asked searching questions about whether Emily might come back and if anyone was keeping her safe. Local law enforcement, already stretched thin, found themselves coordinating not just with state police and the FBI, but with investigative journalists eager for their own leads. Early on, conflicting reports muddied timelines and multiplied confusion. Calls poured in claiming sightings of Emily from as far away as Maine and New York. The story went national. Morning show hosts debated crime prevention strategies, and true crime radio shows reconstructed every minute of Emily's last known movements. Some in town chafed under the glare. An elderly neighbor was hounded for days by a crew convinced she'd seen something suspicious. A teacher was criticized on air for not remembering the color of Emily's backpack. Entire families were drawn into speculation and whispers, as if any minor eccentricity or forgotten detail might now be significant. The sympathy and unity that marked the earliest days of the search sometimes fractured into suspicion and resentment. For the Carmichaels, the world outside became unrecognizable, a circus of hope and horror, compassion and exploitation. Amidst the swelling media storm, some good emerged despite the chaos. The case catalyzed a movement that rippled far beyond Massachusetts. Neighborhoods held their first emergency drills, schools implemented more stringent dismissal procedures, movement for child ID programs grew exponentially. Non-profit organizations dedicated to missing children sprang up in the weeks and months following, citing Auburndale's tragedy as their call to activism. National figures referenced Emily Carmichael's name from podiums, linking her fate to legislation, public service campaigns, and fundraising efforts. Yet for the family at the center, the endless news cycle served as both a lifeline and a relentless source of pain. Tips continued flowing, leads were followed, and prayers, candlelit vigils continued. But with each passing day, the question hung ever heavier. With so many watching, how could Emily remain missing? And for every act of kindness or solidarity, an equal measure of intrusion and anguish arrived at their door, a reminder that while the world might move on for the Carmichaels, terror and hope would remain entwined as long as their daughter was gone. Strange Calls and the Ransom Letters begin. 3 days after Emily's disappearance, as the emotional exhaustion of endless waiting began sapping the Carmichaels' hope, a new kind of torment arrived. It started close to midnight, a shrill ring splintering a house held together by anxious silence. Carla, in her bathrobe, scrambled to the phone, breath caught between hope and terror. On the other end was nothing at all, just a distorted, static silence punctuated by faint, tinny music that sounded like an old radio jingle played too slow. The call ended as abruptly as it began, leaving only a dial tone and a shiver up everyone's spine. The pattern repeated the next night, and the one after, each time at an odd hour, each time with a different snippet of strange instrumental music and no words spoken. The police were notified at once, tracing the calls as best they could, but the technology of 1981 had its limits. Nothing decisive emerged except an increased sense of unease. Was Emily out there somewhere, the silent witness to this torment? Or was the caller merely an opportunistic prankster feeding off a family's agony? On the 4th day, the family's mailbox became the bearer of horror. Carla found a letter, addressed simply to Emily's parents. A cold shudder ran through her as her fingers traced the uneven, blocky letters formed from cut-up headlines and magazine phrases. Inside, a short chilling note demanded $100,000 in cash. The instructions were bizarrely precise. All bills in hundreds, placed inside a single suitcase, delivered in a yellow Oldsmobile to a yet-to-be-revealed location. There was a warning: do not go to police or Emily dies. The note promised more instructions, cryptically stating, "You will hear our music to know it is time." The police took possession of the letter immediately, searching for fingerprints, hairs, fibers, anything. The letter's anonymity, its methodical craft, and the veiled threats were classic marks of either a professional or someone mimicking the true crime headlines that had become household reading. FBI agents, now formally involved, scrutinized every aspect of the note. Was the peculiar focus on music a code, a psychological taunt, or the signature of someone local? The fact that the caller specified an Oldsmobile, and made obscure road references, deepened suspicions that the perpetrator truly knew the neighborhood, and perhaps even the Carmichaels themselves. The next days unfolded in a haze, blurring between hope, desperation, and paralyzing fear. Carla and Thomas discussed the ransom among themselves and with the authorities, their nerves fraying as Carla insisted she would give up everything if it meant bringing Emily home. But the police insisted on caution. Ransom drops were notoriously dangerous, and often, payment did not guarantee a child's return. Still, the family hastily liquidated assets, borrowed from friends, and even offered to mortgage their home to assemble the impossible sum. The town, having heard through the grapevine of the demands, began chipping in small donations, neighbors quietly slipping envelopes through the Carmichael mail slot, or passing along cash through trusted friends. It was a testament to the community's hope and solidarity, even as it barely scratched the surface of what was demanded. The calls persisted. Each night they struck at roughly the same hour. A police officer stationed in the house would snatch up the receiver, recording every crackle, each fragment of warped music. Occasionally, the caller let the line remain open, offering only breaths or the faint sound of someone shuffling paper. FBI analysts compared these calls to regional radio stations, commercial jingles, even old record albums collected from thrift stores in town. Nothing matched exactly. The strangeness of the calls became a kind of psychological warfare, a nightly torture for the Carmichaels. On the 6th day, another note arrived, this one less elaborate, hastily scrawled by hand but containing even more specific demands. The ransom pickup instructions now required the driver to mark the money with a blue ribbon and tape a child's drawing, found in Emily's schoolwork, left on purpose, to the briefcase. "Drive no faster than 60 miles per hour, the note insisted, punctuated by threats in crude, block capital letters. "If these rules were followed," the caller said, "you will get your daughter's voice." Carla read those words again and again. What did it mean? Had Emily been alive? Would they finally hear proof? In the tense nights that followed, all attempts to connect yielded only more cryptic sound bites. Recorders caught the same eerie sound, but never the child's voice the family had begged to hear. Carla pleaded over open lines, whispering then shouting, "Let me talk to my daughter, please, anything, just let me hear her." But the calls would click and fall to dead air. Sometimes Carla was sure she heard a faint echo of a girl's laugh, or just her own memory distorting hope. Authorities called in specialists from the FBI's fledgling behavioral science unit, hoping to create a profile from the Ransom's idiosyncratic language, the precise but bizarre instructions, and the recycled sound clips. Was this someone trying to sound like a criminal mastermind lifted from late-night movies, or an unhinged local with a taste for drama and control? Linguistic experts parsed the grammar, questioning whether the notes, marked by odd phrasing and juvenile spelling, suggested a young suspect or an adult imitating a child. Meanwhile, the family's ordeal became an even greater ordeal as reporters spun countless theories about the ransom, amplifying each cryptic demand. Neighbors wondered aloud who in town even owned a yellow Oldsmobile, and suspicion pulsed palpably beneath every interaction. Some believed the Carmichaels themselves might be targeted for reasons yet unknown: jealousy, revenge, a personal feud gone too far. Others simply mourned for a community forever changed, heartbroken that someone so monstrous could hide among them. For the Carmichaels, the ransom letters became a relentless reminder of their helplessness. Every word, every cryptic image was pulled apart for hidden meanings, as if hope itself could be exhumed from the chaos. The FBI set up wiretaps and deployed decoy cars. State police trailed every yellow Oldsmobile registered within a 50-mile radius. Forensic experts pored over the glue residue and paper fragments, searching for a clue, a watermark, a fragment of handwriting, anything to pierce the fog. But as days blurred into nights, nothing brought them closer to Emily. A week after the first call, the FBI staged a controlled ransom drop using a decoy car and undercover agents, following the caller's increasingly odd instructions. Hours of waiting led only to the echo of silence. No one showed, no money was taken, and no further calls or guidance arrived. The family was left rattled, exhausted, and repeatedly broken by what felt like a sick, unsolvable game. Carla barely slept, afraid of missing a call, running from window to window as if frenzied movement might somehow summon her daughter back. The cruelest part was the ambiguity. Was Emily still alive, hidden somewhere and waiting for rescue? Or had the letters and calls been a smokescreen, cruel distractions hiding what truly happened in the woods that night? Each moment of hope was swiftly crushed by a new wave of dread. Well-meaning friends and strangers flooded the family with tips about psychics, about suspicious cars spotted on highways, about people who claimed to have felt Emily's presence. Police and FBI, stretched to their limits, began sifting every rumor, knocking on dozens of doors each day, and even interviewing classmates who had once fought over jump rope with Emily on the school playground. Meanwhile, the media seized upon every update. National television programs invited expert commentators to dissect each note. Radio shock jocks aired segments replaying the carnival-like music from the calls hourly. Everyone wanted a resolution: viewers, investigators, or simply the devastated Carmichaels. A family's desperate struggle. In the days after the ransom notes and eerie calls, the Carmichael family entered a new territory of torment, a helpless, anguished waiting punctuated by grim determination. Each morning arrived without hope. Each night stretched endlessly as sleep turned to a theater of fear and bargaining. Carla, usually gentle and measured, became a force of sleepless energy, arguing fiercely with the police and FBI about taking action. It wasn't enough to wait. She begged for updates every hour, studied ransom instructions as if she could decode their meaning by sheer force of love, paced the kitchen until blisters formed. Thomas, meanwhile, tried to hold everything together, fielding reporters at the door, answering calls from friends and family, wrangling offers of help that felt as empty as his arms without Emily. He spent hours staring out their front window, watching for anything unusual: a yellow Oldsmobile, a stranger's silhouette, movement in the shadows by the mailbox. He set up a cot by the phone, notebook in hand, poring over every word in the Ransom notes, his mind running over maps of the area and timelines filled with worry. Their surviving children, Michael, Ben, and Lisa, became ghosts in their own home. Michael, the eldest, put himself in charge of updating the neighborhood flyers, designing new posters, and organizing block-wide meetings. He refused to show weakness, but his hands trembled every time the house phone rang. Ben, the middle child, was uncharacteristically quiet, hiding behind stacks of detective novels, as if the solution was buried somewhere in their pages. Lisa, barely older than Emily, clung to her mother and rarely left the family's side, drawing pictures of her missing sister and taping them to windows, in hope and protest against the darkness. The family moved through days in a haze of police logistics and raw emotion. Meals were abandoned mid-bite, if they were eaten at all. Laundry piled up, dust drifted in corners, and the once music-filled Carmichael home echoed only with the shrill tone of the phone and the mournful hush of an absent child. Each new arrival, the mail carrier, a neighbor with a casserole, a classmate with an extra copy of homework, brought a fresh upwelling of hope and heartbreak. Despite the police warnings to stay silent, Carla wanted her daughter's name to be known by every single person from Boston to New Hampshire. She appeared on every local newscast that would have her, pleading, weeping, sometimes angry and defiant, her voice cracking as she described Emily's laugh and swore, over and over, that she would give anything to have her home. Thomas acted as her shield and spokesman when she could no longer bear the attention, but even he couldn't block every phone call from someone claiming to have information or, worse, the psychics and cranks who battered them with false hope and conspiracy. While the FBI coached the family on the procedure for a potential ransom exchange, the Carmichaels spent every waking moment ready. Carla meticulously assembled the requested $100,000 in borrowed bills into a battered suitcase. She ironed a blue ribbon, carefully attached Emily's crayon drawing to the handle, and kept the case at the front door, waiting for the next set of instructions, directions that never arrived. Friends organized bake sales, church collections, and charity drives. A local bank quietly extended a personal loan, and even the mayor's office contributed from an emergency fund. Yet all this generosity could not buy a return address, nor coax another word from their tormentors. Tension grew between the family and authorities as days went by with no meaningful communication. FBI agents stationed in the house tried to reassure the Carmichaels, but their questions and forensics equipment only made the home feel less like a sanctuary and more like an evidence locker. Lisa began sleeping in her parents' bed again, haunted by nightmares that Emily was trapped and calling for her. Michael stalked the neighborhood at all hours, determined to find the yellow Oldsmobile or catch a glimpse of a suspicious figure. Ben withdrew even further, refusing to discuss his sister at all, but secretly built small altars of her favorite things beside his window, tiny acts of faith against overwhelming odds. The Carmichaels' extended family rotated through the house, providing meals, walking dogs, and comforting the children. Aunt Janice took over as the unofficial family point person, handling calls from the media and briefing Thomas and Carla on tip-line developments. Grandparents prayed ceaselessly, cousins created posters in Emily's favorite color, helped distribute flyers to every telephone pole and bulletin board in a 10-mile radius, and delivered updates to classmates who gathered at the park each afternoon for candlelight vigils. Over the course of the next week, the family experienced wave after wave of false starts and agonizing setbacks. One night, a police cruiser showed up with sirens off, lights dimmed, and officers approached with careful words. They'd found a jacket, small and gray, in a storm drain 3 streets from the Carmichael house. The world froze for a moment as Carla rushed to identify it, only to realize through tears and numb exhaustion that it was not Emily's. The same day, a neighbor's tip about a suspicious stranger led to hours of questioning, pursuit, and ultimately a dead end. Every aspect of family life became centered around hope and survival. Dinner was eaten in the living room so as not to miss a phone call. Television was replaced with an ever-present police scanner. Strangers brought casseroles, neighbors fixed the fence, a cluster of Emily's classmates dropped by, holding hands and passing around a collection of yellow ribbons. The Carmichaels didn't have the heart to send anyone away, each visit a reminder of community, and yet, another drop in the ocean of powerlessness. Carla and Thomas cycled through every stage of grief, anger, bargaining, depression, and fleeting hope, multiple times a day. Sometimes in the dim hours of morning, they let themselves believe maybe the kidnapper would call, maybe they'd just been toying with them, maybe Emily was alive. Each time the phone rang, their world stopped. Each time it was a robocall or a local reporter fishing for a quote, that fragile hope crumbled again. They recorded every sound, kept meticulous logs of every call, drove the route home from Sophie's house over and over, hoping to see what might have been missed. As the days dragged on and the ransom exchange never came, fatigue set in. Carla grew gaunt, Thomas unshaven and harsh-voiced with anyone who suggested moving on. The children shrank into themselves, surviving on habit and the memory of Emily's laughter, haunting the kitchen, echoing in the hallway at dusk. Over it all hung the questions: was Emily out there, somewhere, waiting? Would they ever know the truth, even if they could not have her back? Every sunrise brought another day wondering if hope itself was just one more cruelty in this desperate struggle. The desperate search and heartbreaking discovery. The days that followed Emily's disappearance stretched into a living nightmare, each moment weighted with expectation then crushed by the relentless passage of time and absence of answers. By the end of the first week, hope and fear had become impossible to separate. Trained search teams, local volunteers, and international media had converged on the quiet suburb, but despite the scale of the operation, the most haunting reality lingered. There was no sign of Emily. Authorities escalated the search from a missing child case to the largest mobilization the area had ever seen. The woods, once a place of neighborhood adventure, swarmed with law enforcement, K-9 teams scouring the undergrowth, and volunteers in bright jackets combing every inch. Helicopters circled overhead, their floodlights slicing through the night, a steady hum that rarely brought reassurance. The banks of the Charles River were methodically dragged, divers shivered as they combed the cold, murky waters. On land, teams used grid maps, color-coded to show where had been searched, where brush remained stubbornly unmoved, sections marked in red for high priority, then checked and checked again as hours slipped into days. Despite the methodical approach, each day's end felt like a defeat. For the Carmichaels, the house became an information hub. Relatives fielded tip-line reports, volunteers dropped off trays of baked ziti and casseroles, and a rotating watch posted at the door in case, just in case, someone showed up with information or, God willing, Emily herself. Carla hovered between bursts of frantic activity and total collapse, her energy burning out in fits and then reigniting over a rumor, a cell phone ping, a story about footprints found in the mud outside town. Thomas, stoic and sleep-deprived, became a shadow at the police command post, asking questions even the investigators couldn't answer. "Are you sure you've checked that stretch? Did you interview that man who saw her bike every day?" Communities across Massachusetts were transfixed by the story. Schoolchildren wrote letters expressing hope. Prayer circles met nightly. Tips poured in, some heartfelt, some malicious, and some simply the product of people desperate to contribute. The FBI set up a command center in the local high school gymnasium, its scoreboard now tracking checkpoints cleared and calls logged. But for every promising lead, there were a dozen that fizzled, found baseless after exhaustive pursuit. The tension in Auburndale rippled like aftershocks. Houses bristled with searchers, reporters, family friends, all searching for solace in the chaos. Most harrowing were the search parties through the vast maze-like woodlands between West Newton and Auburndale. Volunteers picked through thorny underbrush and swampy soil, mindful of every patch of disturbed ground or fragment of cloth. Children were kept inside, playgrounds deserted, a hush gripping the streets where Emily's laughter once echoed. Each discovery, a candy wrapper, a child's barrettes, a solitary shoe, sent adrenaline surging until, inevitably, heartbreak followed, not Emily's, not connected. On the 19th day, heavy late-autumn clouds hung motionless over a town already cold with dread. The search had shifted focus based on an analysis of the ransom letters and phone calls. Officers and volunteers converged on a sector of dense woods, newly assigned because a K-9 unit had caught a faint trace. Shreds of scent, perhaps a memory held in the fabric of a jacket. The air was heavy as the team worked in slow, organized rows, scanning for anything out of place among the knots of maple and pine. Suddenly one volunteer's foot caught on something not rock nor root, the sharp edge of unfinished wood protruding slightly from a patch of disturbed earth. Shouts sliced through the stillness. Police moved in, cordoning the area as daylight faded. Within minutes, the dig revealed a crude, shallow grave. At its center, what appeared to be a handmade wooden box, sealed and camouflaged with mud and leaves. The crowd held its breath as detectives gently pried open the lid. Inside, the sight was almost too much to bear. Emily's small body lay among her personal belongings, her favorite book, a water bottle, a half-eaten granola bar. The box was lined with a thin blanket and some toys, and even a makeshift ventilation system, a few plastic tubes that wound outside, now caked with dirt and useless. Medical examiners were summoned immediately. Their rapid assessment pointed to a devastating truth. There was no evidence of violent trauma. Instead, oxygen deprivation was determined to be the cause of death. The primitive ventilation system choked off almost as soon as Emily had been hidden away. Officers covered the box with a tarp as the community watched in stunned silence. Some broke down sobbing, others stumbled away in disbelief. News spread like wildfire even before the family was formally notified. Neighbors clung to each other, parents stared out their windows in silent horror. For the Carmichaels, the confirmation arrived as a tidal wave of sorrow, the worst fear realized, erasing any trace of hope that still flickered in those endless nights. Forensic teams treated the site with painstaking care, sifting through soil for stray hairs or fibers, collecting every fragment and photographing each inch. The personal items inside, the book with Emily written on the inside cover, the half-empty juice box, the stuffed toy, became evidence and artifacts of her last hours, reminders both of a failed rescue and a child's bravery in the most terrifying of circumstances. Investigators speculated about the timeline, how quickly Emily had been placed inside, whether she understood what was happening, and how she clung to comfort in her final moments. Reporters relayed the news across the country. Vigils formed anew, this time heavy with the knowledge that a child's magic, her curiosity and innocence, had been sealed away in a box not far from home. The woods, once a backdrop to summer adventures, became a haunted place, a permanent scar on the community and a symbol of deeper collective loss. Deadlock in the investigation process. The aftermath of Emily Carmichael's devastating discovery brought with it a cold, heavy fog of unanswered questions. For all the frantic action in the woods and the collective heartbreak of the town, investigators soon found themselves mired in a deepening quagmire, not of apathy, but of infuriating dead ends. From the outset, law enforcement dedicated unprecedented resources to the case. Dozens of detectives pored over every inch of evidence, working in shifts that blurred night into day. The FBI's local field office deployed its best profilers and forensic specialists, some barely unpacked from other notorious cases. Yet, with each layer peeled back, the mystery only seemed to tighten around them, and the hope of justice slipped further from reach. The site of Emily's makeshift grave was combed and recombed, soil sifted, leaves bagged, every traceable fiber or hair preserved. Crime labs across the state ran samples through their systems. Yet, despite the care with which the kidnapper had constructed the box, right down to the tubing, and the assortment of Emily's possessions deliberately arranged inside, no usable fingerprints turned up. The only prints matched Emily herself, or the searchers who'd uncovered the box. Desperation drove broad net casting. Police interviewed hundreds of neighborhood residents, teachers, repairmen, and passers-by, doing background checks on anyone even remotely connected. No one stood out. Suspicion naturally fell on two local laborers, Lester Neville, an electrician with a reputation for surliness and heavy debts, and a reclusive construction worker who'd previously done landscaping work near the woods. Both men were surveilled, questioned, and their vehicles searched inch by inch. Yet, no physical evidence or credible witness testimony emerged to tie them to either Emily or the ransom letters. There was motive, opportunity, even circumstantial oddities, but nothing hard enough to bring charges to court. The ransom letters themselves, each chilling, cobbled from magazine clippings or scrawled hastily in marker, were examined by handwriting experts, linguists, and criminal psychologists. While the taunting phrases and obsessive detail hinted at someone local, perhaps even someone with knowledge of law enforcement routines, every test from fingerprint dusting to ink analysis failed to reveal a decisive clue. The musical snippets haunting the phone calls proved equally enigmatic. Audio engineers traced them through local radio stations, toyed with the possibility of vintage recorders or instruments, and compared them to countless jingles and ad themes, but never found a perfect match. The deeper the investigation delved, the more it began to feel like the perpetrator had woven himself into the very fabric of the community, or, more disturbingly, that the case was overshadowed by a particularly cunning or lucky stroke of criminal fortune. Everyone had seen something, no one had seen enough. As days stretched into weeks, public pressure became almost as suffocating as the lack of leads. News outlets begged for updates, townsfolk demanded answers. The Carmichaels, once at the center of a supportive wave of volunteers and casseroles, found themselves thrust into repeated police interviews and forced to relive the nightmare in hopes of unearthing some overlooked detail. Carla would recount again and again the phone calls, their weird musical cues, the way the voice never quite matched any local she knew. Thomas obsessively mapped neighborhood traffic, examining every pair of headlights from that night, but the shadow of certainty never arrived. Every viable lead was dissected and dismissed. Polygraph tests were administered to more than a dozen neighbors. Dozens of tips about strange vehicles or late-night noises fizzled into nothing. The yellow Oldsmobile, repeatedly referenced in ransom notes, was traced to several local owners, all with alibis, some even offering up their cars for forensic processing. School records were scoured, teachers re-interviewed, even local delivery drivers brought into the station to reconstruct their routes. The police collected every stray shoe, every abandoned backpack from the woods, but none belonged to Emily or the perpetrator. Psychological profiles conflicted. One FBI profiler argued for an organized offender, someone intelligent, meticulous, who had likely stalked Emily, even rehearsed the crime. Another insisted the crime was marked by youthful recklessness, perhaps suggesting a much younger suspect. The local police, frustrated and increasingly defensive under cruel press scrutiny, vacillated between theories, sometimes latching on to wild rumors, old grudges, family rifts, teens' satanic panic scares, anything to keep the investigation active. Nothing stuck. The emotional exhaustion of investigators began to show. Detectives grew short-tempered, community liaisons burned out, and families of suspects quietly suffered from the storm of suspicion. The inability to close the case took a heavy toll on Auburndale. Residents grew wary of one another. Every odd glance or forgotten alibi was dissected in nervous whispers. Neighborhood trust, so foundational to small-town life, began to erode. Kids were kept indoors, doors now locked at all hours. Some families moved away in quiet desperation, unwilling to raise children where a killer still might be lurking. Meanwhile, resources gradually ran thin. As media attention shifted to new stories, fewer state officers remained assigned full-time. Missing posters faded and tore away in the autumn wind, replaced with patched-over reminders of community events, lost pets, and the occasional desperate new plea from the Carmichaels: justice for Emily. By the following year, the investigation's momentum sputtered. The file bulged with dead-end leads, forensics returns, and polygraph results. Only the Carmichaels and a handful of dogged detectives refused to let the case be archived as unsolved. Political pressure mounted to make a show of progress, but the DA's office balked at bringing any charge that wouldn't withstand the scrutiny of a trial. No confession came. The cruel phone calls and letters stopped as suddenly as they had begun. At annual memorials for Emily, townsfolk gathered to light candles and whisper prayers. The local media ran retrospectives, 1 year without answers, fueling more speculation but rarely producing new tips. The Carmichaels became both a symbol of hope and a stark warning, their tragedy invoked in safety lectures and school assemblies across the state. Some years an anonymous bouquet of wildflowers appeared on the doorstep, a silent gesture that comforted and haunted in equal measure. What remained most chilling about the deadlock was its utter ordinariness. Despite relentless law enforcement effort, copious witness interviews and state-of-the-art, for the era, forensic work, the reality was unrelenting. Sometimes evil goes unseen. Auburndale, once the picture of suburban complacency, saw its innocence not just shattered but quietly buried beneath the weight of its own uncertainty. The Carmichael case haunted careers and blighted personal lives long after the search parties ended. Detectives changed posts or retired with the ache of unfinished business. Neighbors carried silent guilt. Maybe I should have noticed. Maybe I passed the stranger by the woods. And year after year, as technological advances like DNA and digital forensics progressed, hope flickered anew, only to dim each time another lab returned its verdict. No match, no closure, no peace for a little girl lost, and for a town still searching for its shadow. Forensic breakthrough and the closure of the case. In the years following Emily Carmichael's tragic death, the case lingered unresolved, casting a long shadow over Auburndale and leaving a lingering sense of unease across Massachusetts. Forensic methods of the early 1980s offered little hope against a perpetrator who left almost no physical trace, and despite the national attention and exhaustive work by investigators, the file slowly grew cold like so many others. Yet technology, it turned out, does not stand still. As scientific advances began to revolutionize criminal investigation in the late 1990s and into the new millennium, families like the Carmichaels awoke to the possibility that the seemingly impossible might, finally, be solved. Year after year, new techniques arrived. Advanced fingerprint analysis, improved trace chemical tests, and most importantly, the rapid evolution of DNA analysis. For investigators and the grieving, DNA remained the last best hope for real answers. The Carmichael case file was officially reviewed for cold case forensic re-examination in late 2006, when Massachusetts's Attorney General announced several unsolved child abduction cases would undergo full reanalysis. By then, biological evidence from crime scenes was routinely archived with chain-of-custody procedures, even if samples couldn't be tested at the time. It was a detail that now felt almost prophetic. Swabs from the wooden box's interior, hair fibers, and even a single fingernail clipping from Emily herself were secured in a temperature-controlled evidence locker, untouched for decades. Specialists from the State Forensic Lab worked alongside the FBI's increasingly high-tech Criminal Justice Information Services Division. The new wave of forensic researchers were dogged, methodical, and at times almost reverential in their approach to a case that haunted generations of investigators. The catalyst for the breakthrough came not from DNA, but from a hybrid approach, one that married old-fashioned investigative curiosity with the latest forensic tools. In the spring of 2007, a newly trained technician assigned to cross-reference evidence logs noticed a detail that many had previously overlooked. A small, battered tape recorder had been taken from the home of Lester Neville, a local electrician who had once been considered a suspect but for whom no physical connection had been found. Initially, the recorder was dismissed as unrelated, just another household item from a man who, after years of police inquiries, insisted on his innocence. But when the tapes inside the device were run through modern audio forensics, new findings emerged. The peculiar clacking and background whir captured on the Ransom phone calls, recorded years ago by the Carmichaels and police, exactly matched the idiosyncratic mechanical noise of this particular machine. Every shift in the tape drive, every flaw in the drive gears, had now been mapped, like a fingerprint, by audio pattern recognition software that could not have been conceived 2 decades earlier. Further investigation used advanced digital filtering to isolate incidental sounds in the background of the original Ransom calls. Distant barking, the echo of a news broadcast, the jingle of a clock, all indistinct when first heard, but now able to be enhanced and compared to environmental sounds specific to Neville's workshop. Investigators were able to date one tape on the basis of a faint sports radio broadcast audible under the Ransom message, its context matching a game played on a day when Neville was off work and alone in his home shop. Simultaneously, DNA processing employed touch DNA recovery, a method unavailable in the 1980s, to examine surfaces in the box and on the Ransom envelopes. While compromised by time and contamination, one partial profile developed from a fragment of a saliva trace on an envelope matched to Neville's familial line. Not conclusive on its own, but compelling enough to add credence to the mounting evidence. The state convened a new grand jury to review the cold case, and Neville, now in his 70s and living quietly on disability, was subpoenaed for fresh testimony. Presented with the new audio analysis and partial DNA link, his story began to fray. When prosecutors played the restored tapes and showed imagery of the box, Neville reportedly grew agitated but offered only cryptic denials. Several witnesses, including neighbors and former co-workers, stepped forward to recall strange comments Neville had made about the Carmichael case many years before, as well as odd nocturnal routines and an unexplained absence the night Emily disappeared. For the Carmichaels, the possibility of resolution stirred old wounds. Carla and Thomas, now retired and white-haired, watched from the gallery as the Attorney General detailed the forensics and teary-eyed detectives revisited the horrors and agony of Emily's last hours. Michael Carmichael, now an adult, gave an emotional statement about the toll of uncertainty and the desperate need for closure, even if it came too late to heal the original hurt. The trial opened in the spring of 2010 amid renewed but somber media attention. Prosecutors leaned heavily on the forensically matched tape machine, the partial DNA hit, and the circumstantial evidence built painstakingly over the years. Neville's access to both the neighborhood and discarded construction materials, his proximity to the Carmichaels, the strange meticulousness of both the burial and the ransom scheme, and the technological fingerprints left behind. Ordinary citizens filled the courtroom, many familiar faces, now older, who'd once searched the woods with hope or wept at the news of Emily's discovery. The defense attacked each thread, the limitations of partial DNA, the possibility of tape recorders being acquired and reused by many, the decades-long gap in witness recollection. They highlighted the lack of direct eyewitnesses and objected to the admissibility of audio pattern matching, arguing the science was too new and the foundation too speculative. Still, the weight of the evidence, coupled with the emotional gravity of the case, proved insurmountable. After weeks of testimony, including tearful reminders of community trauma, expert breakdowns on forensic methodology, and the persistent question of why Neville had never come forward with any alibi, the jury returned its verdict. Lester Neville was convicted on charges of felony kidnapping, child endangerment, and murder, receiving a life sentence without parole. The verdict drew a wave of emotion from all sides, applause and tears in the gallery, quiet relief for law enforcement, and a bittersweet sense of justice for the Carmichaels, who had for so long lived in a strange purgatory between hope and grief. With the conviction, authorities finally closed one of Massachusetts's most haunting cases. But even in so-called closure, the story's nuances haunted all involved. Neville's conviction rested on the razor's edge of technology and tenacity, his guilt pronounced by a combination of new science and dogged human memory. For the Carmichaels, closure brought its own paradoxes. Relief tangled with sorrow, gratitude laced with bitterness that answers came so late. Surely, they asked, what if these advances had arrived sooner? Could Emily's fate have been different if just one clue, a sound, a fingerprint, a confession, had been noticed in the chaos of 1981? The legal system hailed the Carmichael case as a triumph for forensic perseverance, a testament to never giving up on the missing or murdered, and a warning to offenders that time, or progress, does not erase guilt. It set a precedent for the use of audio forensics in criminal trials, and sparked renewed investment in cold case initiatives statewide. Yet for Auburndale and all the families changed by that September night, the memory of what was lost, and what was finally found, endured, a permanent lesson graven into the community's conscience. Doubt, new revelations, and lingering hauntings. In the years that followed what the courts deemed resolution in the Carmichael case, the small town of Auburndale and the greater Massachusetts community were never the same. On the surface, justice had been served, the alleged perpetrator was behind bars, the family and the public given a modicum of closure. Yet, even as time passed and seasons changed, shadows clung to the town's collective memory, a persistent gnawing doubt that refused to fade. For Emily's older brother Michael, doubt became a daily companion. The conviction had not banished the memories of those strange ransom letters or the cryptic phone calls that played with the family's sanity in the darkest hours. Some of the notes, upon closer inspection years later, seemed oddly juvenile, their phrasing and grammar inconsistent with what one would expect from an adult criminal. Subtle misspellings, awkward word choices, and a strange sort of playfulness in the cutouts all hinted at something off. Michael, now an adult with a family of his own, couldn't shake the sense that the truth might have been more complicated than authorities had dared to admit. Around the 20th anniversary of Emily's death, rumors again began to swirl through both internet forums and local whispers. An anonymous online account, later linked to one of Boston's major newspapers, began sending letters to press organizations, the digital descendants of the ransom notes once dropped at the Carmichael doorstep. These emails, far more articulate but brimming with guilt, claimed that the true culprits had never been caught. The sender, identifying only as a former classmate, provided disturbing details about the construction of the homemade ransom notes and the phone calls, using language and references specific to the small circle of children who had grown up near Emily. Other townsfolk began to look back on discrepancies in their recollections. Some remembered teenage pranks gone too far, others had, back then, dismissed the idea that any of their own kids could be involved in such a brutal crime, a notion too horrific to contemplate amid the panic and pain of 1981. But as years peeled away layers of denial, dark gossip began to seep into daylight. Claims emerged, fragments never substantiated, of secret pacts among teenagers, reckless dares, and the kind of peer pressure that, left unchecked, might spiral into tragedy. Michael's frustration mounted as he petitioned for a formal review of the case, urging authorities to reconsider the authorship of the ransom letters and investigate the possibility of more than one perpetrator. Legal barriers quickly surfaced. statutes of limitations had expired for anyone who might have constructed the notes but not committed the kidnapping itself. Evidence had degraded or gone missing, and many of the former neighborhood kids had moved away, changed names, or forgotten what they might have once heard. The authorities, with the verdict now a matter of public record and the main suspect deceased in prison, were reluctant to reopen so traumatic a chapter. Their practical stance frustrated not only Michael but also amateur sleuths, true crime journalists, and several members of the original investigative team who had always harbored doubts about just how neat the case's resolution had been. The internet, a new domain for speculation, gradually built a parallel archive. Message boards, YouTube documentaries, and podcasts swapping theories about what really happened that night, who else might have known, and whether the police or FBI had truly followed every possible lead. By 2021, the story broke anew. Several major Boston newspapers received a series of anonymous letters. Unlike the ransom demands of so long ago, these contained confessional overtones, meticulously detailing the prank-gone-wrong origin of the calls and notes. The sender, who refused to name others directly, described how a small group of high schoolers, emboldened by the chaos and desperate for attention, orchestrated the hoax with snippets of music, borrowed tape recorders, and cut-out headlines lifted from library magazines. The real kidnapper, the letter insisted with chilling authority, was an opportunist who used their staged distractions to mask his own far darker agenda. Whether this admission was true, or yet another layer in a web of deception, became the subject of furious debate online and in press rooms across New England. Despite the spectacle, legal closure remained out of reach. The justice system, bound by time, by precedent, and by the death of the convicted perpetrator, could not pursue new charges. For Michael and the Carmichaels, and for a battered community, this was a new kind of torment. The possibility that Emily's death had been both the result of monstrous intent and adolescent cruelty twisted the knife of grief yet again. The tragedy remained unresolved in their minds, justice tainted, understanding elusive. The aftershocks wandered through the years, affecting even those born long after the fact. Local schools wrote new policies on bullying, secrecy, and accountability. Parents grew hypervigilant, townsfolk wary of old stories and the unsaid. Memorials continued for Emily, each year laced with an undertone of what if, and the ache of questions that would never be answered. Her memory, both as a symbol of innocence lost and a warning, haunted generations in Auburndale. In the end, the Carmichael case lingered in the public consciousness not just for its horror, but for the unresolved tangle of doubt, guilt, and the murky gray areas of truth and justice. For Michael, for his aging parents, and for a community that, on some level, never forgave itself, the lesson was in the shadows. That the line between tragedy and farce, evil and accident, innocence and guilt, is rarely as clear as a court would hope. What remained was not just the loss of a child, but a permanent fracture in the seeming safety of suburban life, a haunting, unspooled one rumor, one regret, one lost answer at a time.